guys, it's your boy Gsluke here for our weekly course breakdown, this time for the 2022 Mexico Open. It's a brand new event on the PGA Tour schedule, also a brand new venue to break down, which means this is going to be one of the better weeks to go out there on the outright market, DFS market, because there's a lot of unknowns from the course side, of course from the field side. We also have a relatively weak field. It's going to be a huge opportunity for some of us hardcore golf fans. So if you're watching this video, you're at the right place because I'm going to make sure you know everything you need to for this week's event. Whether it's the field, whether it's of course the course where we're going to go hole by hole. We're going to talk about everything that'll play well at Vidanta Vallarta, which is of course a brand new Greg Norman design. It's a little bit unique, typically a par 73, but we'll be playing as a par 71 this week, past Palm greens, down there in Mexico, so a lot to talk about, and I'm expecting it to be relatively scoreable. So we'll talk about all the details, key stats, comp courses, everything you're going to need to know for your research. So with no delay at all, we have a ton to get into. Let's go ahead and hop right on into it. There will be 144 golfers teeing it up this week, what you'd expect for this time of the year, including some of the notables, Jon Rahm, Gary Woodland, both of which I would expect to be extremely popular this week, whether it's in outrights or of course on DFS. You have Tony Finau teeing it up. He's a king of Paspalum, of course, won the Puerto Rico Open famously, so perhaps it could be his week. Also, hometown favorites, Abraham Answer and Carlos Ortiz. I would expect them to have a ton of the local support, and if they're in contention, to have a ton of loud roars around, and also Patrick Reed. But outside of that top-end talent, it really falls off quickly. It's a week where you're going to have to take some shots down low. Like I said before, because a lot of the general public isn't as keen to some of these lower-tier players, this is a week we can take advantage of. So, of course, the headliners are going to be there, but it does drop off relatively quickly. In terms of the cut line, it is going to be the top 65 in ties making the weekend, as you would expect for a normal PGA Tour event. But because we don't have any historical data, of course, this is the first iteration of the Mexico Open, we're going to have, project the cut line. And for me, I'm expecting it to be anywhere between even par and maybe 3 under par. We're going to hop into the course here in a second, but it should be relatively gettable. You have some wide fairways, some greens that are relatively large, and of course, because this is a coastal resort style track, I would expect it to play relatively easy. So with that being said, the course is Vidanta Vallarta. That is a Norman champion course over there at the Vidanta Resort. It is a Greg Norman design, as you would expect via the name, and a par 71, which if you were just going to this course and playing it as a resort guest, you would be playing a par 73. In fact, a par 73 with 6 par 5s and 5 par 3s. A very unique track for all of its resort style guests because it only has 7 par 4s, which is a very unique track if you guys follow golf course architecture, because usually we have 10 par 4s, if not 12 if you're playing a par 70. But nonetheless, this is a unique track, but 2 of those par 5s have been converted down to par 4. So that's why we get the par 71 for these PGA Tour pros. And in terms of its scorecard yardage, it'll be playing at 7,456 yards, which is relatively long, especially for a par 71, and especially long considering there's 5 par 3s. That means that it's really playing to an effective yardage closer to at least 7,600 yards, if not something closer to 7,700 yards in reality. If we take a look at the greens, we don't have an exact yardage on them because the GSCAA has not put out a report for this course yet, but they look right about tour average. We're going to go through a mapping hole by hole of this golf course on some of the satellites, and you'll see they look great about tour average. There's some greens that are large, a few, especially the par 3s, that are relatively small, but in general, I'm not expecting them to be hard to hit, particularly because this is a Paspalum golf course. So whether it's the greens, the fairways, or the rough, you're going to have this grass type, which is what you get in these tropical-like areas. It's more resistant to the heat. It's also more resistant to some of the salt in the air. You get some of these down in South Florida as well. In fact, my home course, where I play about 15 minutes from my house, my apartment at this point, also has Paspalum. So very familiar with this surface, and in general, it plays extremely slow. It's not like POA where it's bumpy, and that's why it's playing a little bit slow. It's just slow because it's sticky. It tends to be kind of like Bermuda grass in that aspect, but it's like you're putting into the grain no matter which direction you're putting. That's the best way I can explain a Paspalum grass. But when you're hitting around the green shots or even iron shots from the fairway, it tends to be like hitting off of a mat. You're able to pick the ball off of it. When you're hitting chip shots around the green, it tends to be one of the easier surfaces to play on. So as a result, because they play slow on the greens, because it's also a little bit easier around the green, you're going to see a huge de-emphasis on the short game. People are going to get away with missing these greens. Of course, the putting, you're going to make a few more putts because they're running slower. Usually when greens are running to 11 and a half is when we see some of these birdie fests. Last week at the Zurich Classic, you saw a ton of putts getting made, and a lot of that was due to the speed of the greens. Another thing to take a look at here is also the fairways. They're huge fairways. In fact, if you take a look at this course on Google, you just go to their website, the first thing they say about this golf course is that you have massive landing areas and a ton of bunkers here. So it's past palm grass, it's got the large fairways, also a ton of bunkers. Those are the three headliners that they hit you with when you go to their website. In terms of some of the more nuanced things, the rough is pretty minimal. There's not much rough to speak of, especially when the resort style guests are there. A lot of the pictures from the course have it at maybe half an inch at the very most. Now, we've been down the Corrales before for the Punta Cana, of course, Puerto Rico Open there with Cocoa Beach. They've had a little bit more substantial rough. It was closer to an inch and a half for those golf tournaments. So even though for resort style guests, we haven't seen much rough at this venue, I would expect it to be at least slightly more substantial this week, but not going to be anything that drives these players crazy. In terms of elevation change, it's a coastal golf course. Now it's not right on the beach. It's about half a mile inland, so it's not truly a coastal golf course, but you're not going to see any elevation change. There will be some mounds in the background though. Those are the Sierra Madre Mounds, which are absolutely beautiful. And in terms of weather, this is a quote-unquote coastal track, right? So you could see a little bit of a weather impact. You're going to have some high winds from time to time. And on their website, on almost every single hole, they talk about wind in some type of capacity. It's usually about whether it plays as a headwind or downwind. Also about a few crosswinds that make a few holes tricky. So in general, this is a golf course where weather could be something to keep an eye out for. But because we're doing this early on a Monday morning, not necessarily something that we can speak on as of right now. All right, guys, this hole-by-hole breakdown going to be a lot more important than most. So this is where we can really take apart the golf course and you can get an idea for how this is going to play because we've never seen it before. And really, this first hole is a great encapsulation of what Vidanta Vallarta has to offer us. So first off, it's a 400-yard par 4, and you can see the most glaring characteristic of this hole is the water on the right, this massive lake. Of course, it runs the entire way up the hole. In terms of your shot off the tee, it's going to come into play. A lot of people are just going to bail out to the left where you also have a fairway bunker. Also, a lot of room over there, but it makes your shot into the green a lot longer. The more aggressive you are in getting the ball towards the right side of that fairway, the shorter shot you're going to have, also the better angle into the green. The further that you miss left or over this fairway bunker, if you're not inside of it, the more that these fairway, or I should say green side bunkers, come into play. So it's a strategic hole, and it really does give you an idea of what to expect here. There's going to be water in play off the tee. There's going to be water in play on a lot of your approach shots, and you're going to have to play this golf course smart. I don't expect it to be all that difficult because, I mean, look at all this room you have out here. So it's not like it's a very small landing area that you have to worry about. But if you're not on top of your strategy, you're not really thinking through all of your golf shots, you could get yourself into trouble. So it's not going to be like a PGA National or, of course, a TPC Sawgrass where you see guys completely eject themselves from the golf tournament, but it could be something to keep an eye out for some of the more volatile players in the sport. On the next hole, you see it's a par 4. It's 445 yards. This is a hole where water's not necessarily in play, but this natural area on the left where it's pretty much a lost ball guaranteed in these mangroves is going to be in play in hole number 2. This is a relatively short hole where you can take 3-wood off the tee. Because it's such a large landing area, I wouldn't expect many people to get into that trouble on the left, and also a relatively large green. You can see it's also relatively flat. That's going to be a recurring theme here. And even though this is a Greg Norman design who usually has relatively undulating greens, also a ton of bunkers, while the bunkers are at this venue, the undulating greens, maybe not so much. I mean, the course boasts about his undulating greens, but from every picture I've seen on this course, doesn't really seem like there's many curves on them to begin with. I mean, if anything, there's little subtle breaks from a lot of the bunkering towards the sides, which if anything screams resort style greens to me. So again, there's not very much information out there. A lot of it is from the golf course itself. And from my understanding, every golf course loves to think their greens are hard to read, loves to think that they are, the best, some of the best greens to putt in the world. And in reality, I don't expect that to be the case this week, at least from a lot of the pictures and from what I've heard from this golf course. Hole number 3 is a hole where water comes squarely back into the picture. So again, you're going to hear a lot of people talk about this being a bomb and gouge type of golf course. And while I would agree to some aspect, you can still get yourself in trouble, right? You have all the room in the world to the right to bail out here. I mean, you can bail out through the fairway if you want to. Don't believe that this area right here is much of an issue. I think it's more of a cart path than anything. Of course, you just can't hook it to the left. You can't hit that duck hook into the water. I guarantee you, you're still going to see a few people do that. So just keep that in mind. There could be some volatility at this event because of a lot of those random water hazards in play. And there's also a few wooded areas, marshy areas like you saw there in hole number 2 that could also come up and bite you. Hole number 4, it's cited as a par 5. This, of course, is for the resort style guests. This is the first hole that was converted, so this will play as a par 4 for the PGA Tour pros, playing close to 500 yards. I believe the scorecard yardage was in the 490 range, and it's going to play tough, right? It's a long hole. You're looking at a driver and a long iron into a green that isn't that large. On the satellite imagery, again, we don't have any of the exact metrics because it's just not published at this point. It's a relatively new venue. You can see it's relatively small though. So going to be a small target, pretty much hoping to get a par there. We get our first par 3 at hole number 5. This is a quote-unquote island green, but not necessarily so much an island green like number 17 at the Players. You have a ton of room to miss here. In fact, I would expect most people that miss the green to be just fine. First off, to end up one of these greenside bunkers, or of course just in the rough. There's at least 10 to 15 yards of room here, so even though this is a hole that's a quote-unquote island green, you have to get onto it via a bridge. I don't expect it to play very difficult, and I don't expect there to be that many penalty shots there. I'm sure somebody's going to do it from time to time because this is a 200-yard par 3. You're hitting a long iron, so if you miss, going to miss a little bit further left to right than with most clubs. These are still tour pros, right? So they're not going to be like these resort style guests who might end up in that water from time to time. Well, number 6 is a true par 5. In fact, it's over 600 yards, 613 yards, a true 3-shotter for the entire field. The only way you're reaching this in 2 is if you have a strong downwind, which we don't really know the direction at this point. Again, this is a brand new venue for all of us. But I would expect it to be a relatively, average difficulty hole. I don't expect it to play all that easy because it's still a true 3-shotter, but it's also a par 5. And for some of those longer hitters, they're probably just going to have a flip wedge into it. So I would expect to see some birdies there at hole number 6, but it's not like some of these quote unquote resort style holes where you're really looking to get birdie at the very least. Kind of like hole number 7 here, which is a drivable par 4. It's going to play at 298. That is the scorecard yardage that they gave us, which means a lot of players could potentially hit 3-wood here. So again, depending on the direction of the wind, it's either going to be this hole that's easily reachable with a 3-wood or that par 5 that'll be downwind that you might be able to reach into with a driver 3-wood. So one of these 2 holes is going to be a very solid birdie opportunity because one goes one direction, one goes the other. Unless, of course, you get the side wind on both, where it actually could be the most difficult situation on the golf course because here you'd be in between a 3-wood and a driver there at 298. And, of course, on this hole that's relatively narrow for this golf course, a side wind makes your drive and your second shot with a wood very difficult. So it's an interesting hole depending on the wind. And that's kind of why I said before, we could see a more difficult set of conditions if we get those winds. So something to keep an eye on there for sure. Hole number 8 is an absolute bear of a hole. You got water the whole way down the right, and it's also almost 500 yards. So this is a hole that you're really just trying to make par on. You have a ton of room to the left to bail out. So, a common theme here, even though we do have the water, it's not like it's out of play, but it's also not necessarily in play like you would see at a TPC Sawgrass or a PGA National, where it's going to almost border the fairway. fairway. The green, you also have a little bit of room to the right. Now, there is some undulation from the green down to the water here, but it's not anything that's going to take shots, that are just trundling off the green into the water, right? You're going to have some steam on them with a long iron to end up in this water. So even though it is a difficult long par 4, not impossible, right? You might see a few birdies there from time to time. Hole number 9 is a short par 3. This is the easiest par 3 on the golf course. The water isn't really in play on this hole, especially because you have so much room, right? Unless it's a front pin, you have somebody completely mishit it, chunk it, that kind of thing. You might see a few water balls, but for most of the field, this should be a relatively gettable hole, especially compared to some of those long par 4s and long par 5s that we've seen, right? There's a lot that can go wrong when you have to hit driver off the tee, and of course, when you have to push it down there with a long iron. Now getting to the back 9, you can see it's going to look very similar to the front 9. This is a relatively gettable par 4, not drivable unless they put the tee box up, which they might do from time to time, right? It's the first time, so we have no idea on their intentions, but if they use one of these tee boxes a little bit further up, could be easily drivable. But the one thing that makes this hole fun, especially if they use the right hand hole location, is you kind of got water over here to the right that might come into play, or over the green. So if they really push that tee box up, rather than it playing 380, they play it closer to 300 yards. Could be a fun hole to watch, particularly over the weekend. So we'll have to see what their plans are for hole number 10, but could be fun. Hole number 11 is a par 3 where the water truly is in play. I would expect the tour staff to put a lot of the pins towards the right or just the front left over here. Anything to bring that water into play. The other par 3s that we've looked at, there's been plenty of room to miss. So I'm expecting them to make at least one of these par 3s difficult for these players. Hole number 12 is a 620-yard par 5, also going to be a true par 5 on the docket. It's long, it's a true 3-shotter. There's not much trouble off the tee. You have that pop bunker in the fairway, which I'd expect most players to get over with ease. You can see a 300-yard drive completely clears that. Layup is relatively easy, also relatively wide open, and the green going to be absolutely peppered. So this is a birdie hole for sure. Something that you definitely want to take advantage of here on the back 9. The next hole is a short par 3. There's no water in play at all. I would expect this to be another birdie opportunity. And you can see it's a little bit different than most courses where the par 4s, you're kind of just hoping to hold on. The par 5s aren't even really gimme birdie chances, right? If you have a good wedge game, now it's not really about long iron game this week. It's going to be all about the wedge game on those par 5s. The par 3s are the gettable holes, right? They're all like 170, 180 yards. You're putting the ball on a tee and able to put the attack. You're able to go at it with all that you can. So that's certainly something that I'll be looking at. Par 3 scoring going to be a lot more important this week than it would be at other golf courses. Hole number 14, this is a hole that was converted to a par 4, I believe. It's hole number 16 that was converted. This is still a par 5, 577 yards. This is the one par 5 that could be gettable. So that's why I was slightly confused whether it was this one or 16, but this one will be the par 5. You can see if you're going to go for it, it does bring water into play. You have water on the right. Some nasty little bushes over there on the left. So it is a little bit of a risk-reward type of opportunity. But if it's coming down to it on a Sunday, maybe they play the tees a little bit further up, closer to 550 yards rather than 580 yards. Could be an interesting hole coming down to it. Hole number 15 is 462. You got the water the whole way down the left, so you got to worry about that. But another large landing area. You got the water going into the green, so perhaps the water a little bit scarier for some of these left side pin locations, which I would expect to see over the weekend. So another hole where, it's gettable, right? You have enough room out there, but if you hit a shank or, you get in your own head and hit a bad shot, it could come up and bite you. Hole number 16 is the par 5 that was converted. You can see it's 549 yards. Now, I would expect them to play one of these up tees. I believe on the scorecard yardage, it was closer to 505 yards, something there in the 500 to 510 yard range, which is, no gimme, right? It's still an extremely difficult, demanding par 4, but at the same time, it's still not 549 yards. So just keep that in mind when looking at the stats on here. It's not going to be perfect, of course, because they're adjusting it for these tour pros. But another hole where you're really just looking to get it up there around the green, get up and down, and get out with par. So because you have these shaved off areas that are past palm, as you've seen on most of these holes, a lot of the surrounds here are shaved off fairway areas. And like I said before, past palm, when you're in the fairway, it's like hitting off of a tee. It's not going to be that hard to get up and down. So I know it's a long hole. A lot of these holes, 450, 500 yards, 510 on some of them for some of these par fours. They're going to be difficult. They're not overly difficult, though. Hole 17 is the longest par 3 on the golf course, also the most difficult. Water certainly comes into play when it's an over 200-yard approach shot. And if you're over the green here, depending on where they put the pin locations, could be difficult as well, especially if they're using some of these back pin locations, which on Sunday, it's going to bring the water on the left side into play if you overhook it. And if you go over the green, it's going to be tough to get it to a pin location tucked towards the backside. So that could be a difficult hole coming Sunday. And hole number 18 is a par 5. So this is a true par 5. It will be for the tour players, and it's gettable, right? It's long, but it's something that these players could take advantage of. And there's not really any water in play. There's some trouble on the right in terms of those trees. But if you can get it up there in 2 or get it up there around the green, this 50 to 60 yard range like we have here on the Pro Visualizer, certainly a gettable hole that you're hoping to close out with a birdie. All right, and now for our key stats for analysis. Some of the stats I'm using to identify my favorite plays of the week. At number 1, a little bit of a surprise, but shots gained off the tee, which usually approach takes the crown. But this week, a little bit of a change up because first off, we've got the distance of this golf course, which is close to 7,500 yards to begin with. But like I've already mentioned, could play closer to 7,700 or even 7,800 yards when we consider the setup and the fact that it's at sea level and at a paspalum golf course. So distance is going to be a help this week, but also accuracy. So we're not really hunkering down on one aspect of off the tee or another. You're going to have to be long and accurate off the tee. There's those waist bunkers, all of the water that's in play off the tee, and of course the distance on terms of the yardage that you're going to have to be able to take advantage of and be able to take care of. If you're a little bit reckless off the tee, if you're not able to set yourself up on approach into some of these smaller greens, you're not going to be able to take it to 15 to 25 under par, which I expect to win this golf tournament. The guys that are putting themselves in position, they're also hitting some of the best iron shots, are going to take this place low. You're going to see a ton of putts made. You're not going to see many people making bogeys out there. The only people that are going to go out there, miss the cut, are the guys that aren't sharp with their ball striking. So this is really a week. You can certainly hunker down on that. It's not a surprise to see shots gained approach there at number 2. Of course, it's usually at number 1, so the lowest it's ever going to be is at number 2 for me here on the channel. But you saw some water into greens, so it's not just off the tee where you could get yourself into trouble. If you're a little bit hairy with your approach play, could also easily make a double or a triple bogey. So that's also something that I'm really looking into this week. And I know it's just number 1 and number 2, but that's a majority of what I'm looking at. This is really going to be a ball striker's affair. You've seen guys like a Victor Hovland win at Mayakoba, which is, of course, I very much so comp here. We're going to talk about that course also. Corrales, what you see for the Corrales Putacana, another golf course that compares extremely well here. And at both of those venues, it's all about the ball striking. So that's something that checks off from the eye test, but also with a lot of the correlation data. If you take a look at the birdie or better percentage, that'll be my number 3 key stat. Because you're going to expect a winning score that's relatively low here, unless wind comes in here and completely blows it up, you're going to have to be able to make those birdies because you're inevitably going to find yourself in trouble here. Much like a PGA National or a TPC Sawgrass, it's a little bit less impactful here because you have a little bit more room between the fairway and a lot of those hazards. But if you hit 1-2 bad shots, that's 2, maybe even 3 double bogeys on the scorecard. So a lot of these players that find themselves in contention there on Sunday are going to have to face some adversity at some point. And the players that are aggressive and that are going to go out there and try and make those birdies are the players that are more incapable of making up for that. So that's the number 3 key stat that I'm looking at. Some of the other things I'm including in my modeling. First off, we have par 3 scoring. Because there's 5 par 3s on the docket, that is something that I'm certainly taking a look at. Shots gained putting might have been a little bit of a surprise to not make the top 3, but because we're on paspalum green surfaces, there's a little bit of a de-emphasis on the putting play. And of course, we don't have a huge sample size on paspalum. So I find it hard to make it a huge part of my modeling. We don't have a huge sample size to rely on for a lot of these players, or even any of a sample size for some of them. Par 5 scoring is also a part of my modeling. I know there's only 4, not the 6 for the usual resort style guests, but also something that could differentiate the scoring. We already talked about shots gained around the green a little bit, not mattering all that much. There's not much undulation to these greens, especially from what we can see on the satellite modeling. And paspalum tends to de-emphasize that too. So just not really something I'm looking at a ton. Punting around the green play towards the bottom of my modeling, but as per usual, you can't ignore it, right? It differentiates players week in and week out, and you're going to see, 2-3 players up there in the top 10 to 15 that have just insanely good weeks with the short game, and that's why they find themselves in contention. So certainly not something that you can just blindly ignore this week. And now for our comp courses. So I mentioned before El Camaleon for the Mayakoba Golf Classic, a course that I'm looking at as a comp. So that comes in at number 1. It's a resort style golf course, so it checks that box. You have past Palm greens. You're dealing with an emphasis on the off the tee play at the Mayakoba. It's not a surprise that a guy like Victor Hovland was able to win that event. In fact, I won the GPP there for $25,000 when we were at Mayakoba. So, a lot of good vibes with that event. And now we're back in Mexico for another coastal past Palm type of event. So maybe this is the week where we go ahead and take down another GPP, right? Got some of those vibes here. Wells Fargo Championship we've taken down before, Tour Championship. So just tournaments where, we feel good, right? Much like a returning champion returning to a place that he's won at before. So that's a comp course we're looking at, and we can use a lot of crossover, especially from some of the leaderboard data. Not a golf course that we have shots gained metrics for. And number 2, we have the Corrales Golf Club. That's for the Corrales Punta Cana golf tournament. That's also a relatively long golf course. It actually plays closer to 7,600 yards, sometimes 7,700 yards, depending on how they set that up. But coastal, you have a lot of wind in play, past Palm grass, a lot of similarities that we can draw between these golf courses. So in terms of comps, number 1 and number 2 are extremely correlated to success at this venue and going to be a huge part of my modeling. And again, there's no shots gained metrics for the Corrales, so it's only going to be leaderboard data that we have. But given that we've been at these golf courses for at least a 2-year sample size now, sometimes longer for these events, we do have some data to draw off of. And now there at number 3, we have Cocoa Beach Golf Course. It's for the Puerto Rico Open. That venue, you guessed it, past Palm grass, coastal. You got the windy conditions. Now, not quite as long, so it's not as much of a ball striker's paradise as what you have, but also a golf course that you've seen Victor Hovland win at. A lot of the reason why I played Victor Hovland at the Mayakoba is because he won at the Puerto Rico Open. So there's some type of crossover there. You saw a lot of other players like Emiliano Grillo have success at the Puerto Rico Open and also at the Mayakoba Golf Classic. Another player in my lineup that week that ended up going off. So it worked there, and I'm going to go back to it again, right? There's a lot of similarities on these surfaces. And like I said before, past Palm hugely de-emphasizes around the green and putting. I mean, I can just tell you from experience, when I go to places with Bermuda grass, I really struggle around the green and putting because it's so much more difficult. So that's definitely something I'm looking at this week and we'll be including in my modeling. All right, that's all I've got for the course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and let me know down in the comments what you think the winning score is going to be this week. Personally, I'm going to take 19 under par, so I'm expecting it to be relatively gettable. Maybe there's one day where the wind kicks up. That's why they don't take it absolutely nuclear to something like 23 or 24 under. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, I really appreciate all of your support here, guys. We will have even more golf content coming out, first off, later on today, but also throughout the week, whether it's for DFS, for prize picks, also for Showdown. We're going to have you covered for everything you need to know this week. So if you're placing outright bets, playing DFS, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of that to come. Also, if you haven't already smashed the like button, make sure you go ahead and do that as well. Helps me with growing the channel, and like I said before, guys, really appreciate all of the support. Until next time, best of luck with all of your bets, all of your DFS lineups for this week, and let's get this cash.